Rachel Baumberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here with William Cavanaugh, who is author of the new book, Field Hospital, The Church's Engagement with a Wounded World. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Rachel.
It's great to be with you today.
Oh, good to be with you.
I want to start with the title of the book, which I think you chose very carefully. Field Hospital. Where does it come from, and what does it mean both to you and to the book?
It comes from an interview that Pope Francis did about 6 months into his papacy, where he described the church as a field hospital, and he was trying to express the idea that he said, when you are on the field of battle, you don't ask somebody about their sugar level or cholesterol level. You just bind up their wounds first, and then you can attend to other matters later. And I think what he had intended by that was to say that the church needs to concentrate on the kind of fundamental issues. Talk about Jesus first, and then we can get around to the kind of hot button issues later. So I think I chose that then as a way of honoring that same kind of idea, to getting at the kind of what's at the heart of Christianity and what's central to it, but also kind of taking that metaphor and using it for my own purposes as well, talking about the church kind of binding up wounds in the political and social arenas. So a lot of the book is about politics and economics and violence. And talking about the church not just as a hospital, but a field hospital, something that's mobile, that doesn't try to kind of claim its own space, but goes out into the streets, as it were, as Pope Francis has asked us to do, and therefore not a kind of rigid institution, but more something that responds to the needs of the world in a kind of flexible way.
Yeah, the book is rather broad-ranging in terms of talking about markets and economics and politics and liberty and violence. And what is the uniting theme that joins all of these various discussions together for you?
I think the idea that we live in a wounded world, and what we're called to do as Christians is to help bring Christ's healing to the world. We often think of salvation as kind of plucking a few survivors out of the wreckage of this world and installing them in heaven. And I think what salvation means in a deeper and more scriptural sense is the kind of recreation, restoration of a fallen and wounded world. And so that's, I think, what the church is called to. And I try to kind of bring that into conversation with political and economic realities.
As we sit and talk here about this, the news is all about the Paris attacks and the terrorism that's going on in the world today. You devote a chapter in this book to revisiting a previous book, The Myth of Religious Violence, right, and sort of addressing criticisms and developing thought from that earlier work. Why is this still a conversation that is so much needing to take place? And what do we make of terrorists who seem to be religiously motivated, and how does that tie into religion?
There's no question that the terrorists who pulled off the Paris attacks were motivated by their version of Islam. And I try to make it clear in the book that there's no question that people can and do use Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and so on as a motivator for violence. What I think the myth of religious violence is that there's this idea that somehow religious violence is more virulent and more pervasive than secular violence. And so what I try to do in the book is to level the playing field and show that people kill for all sorts of things. They kill for ideas of jihad, they kill for the sacrificial atonement of Christ, but they also kill for free markets and free elections and the invisible hand of the market and the United States as worldwide liberator and ideals like freedom and mundane things like oil and so on. And so part of the problem is that we view the Paris attacks through this lens of this myth of religious violence, and that then helps us to kind of blame the violence on just some kind of crazy religious ideas that these people have had, and therefore excuse ourselves from looking at the broader context of, for example, American actions in the Middle East over the last century. I don't think that people would have been motivated by this hatred of America had we not been meddling in their world for the last 100 years. And so the myth of religious violence helps us to ignore all that and just blame it on their kind of crazy religious ideas, and that's what I'm trying to kind of do away with. ISIS has this whole kind of theology of this apocalyptic war where the armies of the West are going to invade, and then it'll be this kind of end of the world scenario where Jesus comes back and leads the armies against the armies of the West and so on. And this is an idea that you can find in different forms in earlier Islamic thought, but it wouldn't have such purpose if armies from the West hadn't in fact actually invaded their territory. So this, what seems to us like some crazy apocalyptic fantasy, just seems like, the evening news to them. So.
Yeah. You talk also in the book quite a bit about religious liberty, and there have been some huge cases in which this has been debated in society. But you see, I think, some danger, some risks inherent in churches and religious organizations playing what we'll call the religious liberty card.
Right.
Why is that?
Yeah, this has to do, it's related to the question of religion and violence. The whole question of what is religion is a particularly fraught question. And in the myth of religious violence, I argue that there isn't a kind of essential difference between religious, so-called religious and so-called secular ideologies and institutions. And this has to do with the question of religious liberty, too. People argue about the liberty part of it. What does freedom mean? But they don't argue about what do we mean by religion, and that very definition has had an important role in certain Supreme Court cases trying to determine what is religion and what's not religion. And so I look at that question and wonder if this is our best strategy to define ourselves as a religion and then ask for freedom. So I look at Tissa Wegner's work with the Pueblo Indians in the 1920s, very interesting field work that she's done, and she shows that the Pueblo Indians had no term for religion. They were in the, they didn't kind of separate religion out from the rest of life, which is what I argue is what Christianity traditionally was as well. There was no separate category of life called religion. Yeah. But then in order to defend their practices against government interference, they kind of assume this idea of religion and claim religious liberty, which does buy them some protection for their dances from the government's attempts to shut them down. But it's a two-edged sword because it also then brings up the idea that religion is this individual thing, and now people in the tribe start claiming the right to opt out of the traditional dances of the tribe, and so it actually increases their assimilation to American culture and divides the community. And I argue that this is the danger in claiming this religious liberty for Christians as well. You see in the Catholic Church's campaign for religious liberty, you see this kind of hyper-patriotism and assimilation to American culture and individualism that I think is ultimately, in the long run, is destructive. So in the short run, I think that it might be an effective strategy to win protection for certain practices, but in the long run, I think this is something that we ought to be skeptical about.
Yeah, that in using this as a defense, it forces us to compartmentalize the religious parts of our life and our society into a neat little package.
Right.
And it doesn't really fit.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm not just a Christian on Sunday mornings, or in certain, I'm a Christian all day, every day.
Right.
And I love your question. Are we free not to be a religion?
Right.
Great question. Now, obviously, as the American culture becomes more and more secularized and in some ways very aggressive towards religion, the church's engagement with culture is going to be one of the greatest challenges any of us will face. What is your vision for how the church needs to engage the world? Obviously, we need to maintain our own, robust identity, but we also need to get out there.
Right.
So how do we accomplish these two very different goals?
Right. We have to make our identity getting out there, I suppose. I think that's what Pope Francis is kind of calling the Catholic Church to, and I think other churches can respond in the same way. That it just can't be the case anymore where we think we're going to restore the church's power in society, or we circle the wagons and condemn the world and so on, and accuse it of relativism and all different kinds of things, which may be true, but it's just not going to help to kind of stand in a defensive position. And so what we need to do is live lives that are attractive and beautiful, and people will hopefully come and see and be attracted to that. But it has to happen by attraction and not condemnation and not coercion. But it just needs to be a life that's true and good and beautiful that people will come to. I mean, Gerhard Lofink says that this is the whole logic of election, is that God creates one community of people that supposedly lives a different kind of life, and people become attracted to that, and that's how God is a nonviolent revolutionary. God wants to change the world, but God has time, and so he does it by attraction and not by coercion or violent revolution. And I think that's the way we have to live. And the kind of identity has to be a sort of hybrid identity, I guess, of being Christians that are for others and with others.
Now you end the book, I think, in a very good way with an essay on Dorothy Day, whom Pope Francis recently praised, and I think a lot of people were looking her up after that speech. Who is this Dorothy?
She made all those movies with Rock Hudson.
Right, yeah. What about the figure of Dorothy Day continues to just give us a positive example of how to be the church in the world?
Yeah, there's so much that can be said about Dorothy Day. I guess one of the things that I find really compelling about her is that she has a very traditional kind of orthodox understanding of what God is doing, and precisely that confidence that it's God that's saving the world. Then she is relieved of the necessity of kind of making the world come out right through the use of violence or anything, but she can just kind of witness to what God is doing, especially amongst the poor and most disenfranchised people in society. And so I find that a really, for one thing, it kind of confounds our dichotomies of right and left and Republican and Democrat and that sort of thing. But she is for a kind of revolution in social affairs, but she doesn't think that working through the state is the way to get about that, because the state is part of the problem. Really, what we need is a kind of direct personal engagement, one-on-one with people in their circumstances as they are, and so not just kind of sending money to the state and hoping that the state takes care of people, which they rarely do, but actually through personal sacrifice, kind of creating spaces where we can encounter other people and help heal the world. So I find her a tremendously important figure in that regard.
Your field of study would best be called political theology, which I think you say some would consider an oxymoron, and others might consider a bit of a threat.
Right.
How do you work as a political theologian? And I guess I should ask, are you a threat?
I'm not a very threatening kind of guy, am I? How do I work as a political theologian? What do you mean?
What does it mean to be working in political theology, and what is your approach to this particular field of study?
Yeah, I guess what political theology names for me, and I have to say that it names different things for different people, but what it names for me is that God's salvation is a this worldly thing. And we need to be attentive to the way God is working in the structures of power and in the ways that money is used and distributed and the goods of the world are used. So I guess that's what I mean by political theology. And in that sense, all theology is political in one sense, but I want to be careful about that for a couple of reasons. One is that the way politics is usually thought of is the state. And I'm trying to argue for a kind of broader understanding of what politics means. It's about the common good, not just about the state. But also I'm beginning to get kind of a bad conscience about the way that political theology often kind of makes theology too this worldly and doesn't talk about God enough. And so, but if those things are kind of taken into, what I mean by political theology, then I think it's a good and worthy adventure.
Well, thank you for keeping both the politics and the theology in political theology. And thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Rachel.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, pleasure for me too. Thank you.
The book, again, is Field Hospital, The Church's Engagement with a Wounded World.